Olá, boa tarde a todos. Vamos então iniciar a sessão 4 da nona Conferência Passivhaus Portugal. We have our speakers already in our Zoom session, Llyod Alter and Andrew Michler. We will do this brief introduction in Portuguese, and then we will continue the entire session in English, okay? Vamos então dar início à última sessão e à sessão de encerramento da nona conferência. Trata-se de um evento organizado pela Embodied e pela Associação Passivhaus Portugal. Vamos começar por agradecer, como habitualmente, o apoio dos nossos parceiros de comunicação, dos nossos parceiros institucionais e dos nossos parceiros estratégicos. Queremos relembrar os próximos cursos oficiais Passivhaus que irão decorrer em Portugal e em língua portuguesa. Temos então o curso Certified Passivhaus Tradesperson, com início em fevereiro de 2022, 3 dias, uma vertente mais prática para quem está em obra. Também a começar em fevereiro de 2022 o curso Certified Passivhaus Designer, duração de 10 dias, direcionado exclusivamente para quem está ligado ao projeto e à consultoria. Portanto, mais direcionado para arquitetos e engenheiros. Temos no nosso site mais de 60 soluções dos parceiros da rede Passivhaus e lá podem encontrar no menu Soluções as soluções adequadas e os produtos adequados para construir uma Passivhaus, para ter uma Passivhaus em Portugal, e as soluções estão agrupadas pelos diferentes setores. Já realizamos 8 conferências. Conseguem aceder, ver e rever toda a informação apresentada, todas as apresentações em PDF e vídeo, os workshops que foram realizados, têm toda essa informação disponível no nosso site. Temos também procurado disseminar a Passivhaus com outros eventos, seminários e workshops de entrada livre. Já percorremos todo o país, norte a sul, ilhas, e também por videoconferência, e também conseguem encontrar essa informação no nosso site. Vamos rever ou ver, para quem se junta pela primeira vez à conferência, a mensagem de boas-vindas.
Olá a todos, sejam bem-vindos à nona Conferência Passivhaus Portugal 2021. Este é o maior evento em Portugal sobre a Passivhaus, por isso pretendemos celebrar e mostrar a vitalidade da Passivhaus em Portugal e no mundo. Os tempos que vivemos têm-se afirmado como tempos muito exigentes, tempos de resistência, em que exigem o melhor de cada um de nós, e são por isso tempos em que é urgente afirmar com cada vez mais veemência a necessidade de construir alternativas aos modelos atuais. São por isso tempos em que é urgente exigir Passivhaus para todos e fazer a transição do parque edificado. O crescente interesse na Passivhaus em Portugal mostra que esta é uma alternativa aceite e desejada. A cada vez maior capacidade instalada da Passivhaus em Portugal mostra que é possível construir esta alternativa. Sejam bem-vindos à nona Conferência Passivhaus Portugal 2021. Vamos construir o futuro que queremos.
Vamos só relembrar o funcionamento da sessão. Portanto, os participantes, todos devemos ter o microfone desligado durante as apresentações e devemos ligá-lo quando quisermos intervir no período de debate e discussão. Devemos também ter as câmaras ligadas para, no fundo, ser mais fácil reconhecer quem está a participar na sessão, e a intervenção oral também só será permitida a quem tiver a câmara ligada. Em qualquer momento da apresentação ou da sessão, podem colocar os vossos comentários e as vossas perguntas utilizando o chat, utilizando o bate-papo do Zoom. E também estamos a transmitir via streaming na página do Facebook da Associação Passivhaus Portugal, e lá também podem participar, colocando os vossos comentários e as vossas questões na caixa de comentários que são depois transmitidas aqui aos oradores. Este é o programa que estamos agora a encerrar. Estamos a entrar aqui na reta final da Conferência Passivhaus Portugal 2021. A exposição, que desde o primeiro dia esteve disponível com as apresentações dos parceiros em vídeo e PDF. E aqui um apanhado dos 3 primeiros dias em que já tivemos a conferência a decorrer. Têm já acesso a todas as apresentações dos 3 dias, dos 3 primeiros dias, das sessões 1, 2 e 3, portanto, em PDF e em vídeo. E vamos então, sem mais demoras, entrar aqui na sessão 4, que será moderada pela professora Clara Val, da Faculdade de Arquitetura da Universidade do Porto. Olá, Clara.
Boa tarde, desculpa, estava com o microfone ainda desligado. Boa tarde a todos.
Olá, boa tarde. Agora passo para ti.
Ok. Pronto, eu dava as boas-vindas aos nossos colegas. Llyod, it's a pleasure to meet you again. This time not in person. We have the honor to have a speaking lecture in the Faculty of Architecture last 2 years ago, not last year, 2 years ago. I'm switching to Portuguese. Llyod é arquiteto canadiano. Ele é professor de Design Sustentável na Riverson University School of Interior Design e é design editor do The Triader, um dos principais órgãos de comunicação a nível mundial sobre sustentabilidade. É uma presença habitual, posso considerar já uma presença habitual nas conferências Passivhaus, uma vez que existe uma ligação de intenções, quer da Passivhaus, quer de toda a investigação do Llyod. Ele hoje vai nos falar sobre Living the 1.5 Degrees Lifestyle. Llyod, the floor is yours.
Hello, it's a pleasure speaking to you again. I love doing these Portugal Passivhaus talks. I wish I could be there in person this year instead of doing this by Zoom, but perhaps next year. Since I last spoke with you, I have published a book called Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle. It's my first book, but it's been printed, and I've already been asked if it will be translated into Portuguese, and I'm looking into it. Now, what the book is about is how we have to deal with the carbon crisis that we face, which, of course, this is the famous hockey stick that shows how the carbon has been increasing so radically. And in the Paris Accord in 2015, certain agreements were made to set a carbon budget, a target, and a limit on warming. And at the time in 2015, they talked about how we had to keep the global warming of the average warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But in 2018, they did an addendum and say, no, the problems with 2 degrees are too severe and we have to hold it at 1.5 degrees. And to basically keep under that carbon budget, which when they did this was at 420 gigatons, which is that hard ceiling number to stay under 1.5, we have to start reducing our carbon dramatically. And it's no longer a slope, it's now a cliff. We really have to cut it dramatically and now. When this was done, it was 420. According to this calculator that I use, it's down to 275. So every molecule of carbon that goes into the air goes against this. And a lot of people say that your personal actions don't matter, that it's basically political action that matters. Michael Mann, the climate scientist, actually said that taking personal actions undermines support for the substantive climate policies needed. This is convenient for Exxon, Shell, and BP. BP, you may recall, 15 years ago was talking about carbon footprints as a way of diverting attention from their own actions. People would say British Petroleum invented the term carbon footprint to blame us for what we're doing. In fact, it's not true. It was invented by Dr. William Rees a few years early. They co-opted it. Now, other people will say, we don't have responsibility, just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. I had these great things off Twitter that said, 100 companies are responsible, so it's not my air conditioning. 100 companies are responsible, so I can make Bitcoins. 100 companies are responsible, so I can eat cows. Basically, it's an excuse that everyone uses. But if you go back to the report where it came from, you find they're not actually companies. They're entities. They're national groups like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia, and nobody's going to be telling them what to do. We have to stop buying what they're selling. The other thing that they didn't say when they say this, that these companies are responsible, is that 90% of it are scope 3 emissions. That's basically our using their fossil fuels, us buying what they're selling. We buy it, we put it in our cars, we burn it. So are they responsible for the carbon, or are we? You know, every building in Canada where I live is heated by gas. Is it the gas company, or did I happen to like a cheap way to keep my house warm? As the IPC says, every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. So we have to make difficult choices. Now, I'm not saying that political action and group action doesn't matter. Of course it does. Collective action is critical, but our individual actions matter too. Now, a few years ago, a study came out of Finland that looked at what we have to do to change our lives to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And it assumes that emissions are caused by consumption, not by production of the oil companies. They call them lifestyle emissions based on our choices. This woman activist in London, Rosalind Reedhead, is the way I found out about it. She decided that she would try to live a year with less than 1 ton of carbon. And that's a very tight budget. It's almost impossible. It's like background noise for a North American like me. I had a look at these lifestyle carbon budgets, and I thought that the proposed budget for 2030 was much more reasonable, 2.5 tons. And that's basically per capita, divide the world population into the total carbon emissions that we can have. Now, half of the world already lives under 2.5 tons, and they're living in energy poverty. But you can see that Canadians and Americans way up in the upper right-hand corner are way too high. I tried to look in this graph and I couldn't actually find out where Portugal is, but for many reasons, I think it's probably pretty good. Also, you know, the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions in the world. And that's not, the richest 10% probably includes just about everyone who's here watching this. It's really the developed world. Now, the study was recently updated. This came out a few weeks ago with a bigger group. And they looked at countries, and again, you can see I'm from Canada, right up at the top. They're saying 14.2 tons. The United Kingdom, 8.5. Again, I don't know where Portugal comes in, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's around the 5 point. In the original study, they looked at the main lifestyle elements that cause our footprint. Their nutrition, housing, mobility, the stuff we buy, and leisure and services. So what I did is I did a massive spreadsheet where I basically for a year tracked everything that I did. I divided the 2.5 ton target by the number of days, and I got 6.849 kilograms per day. But it's hard. How do you calculate it? For instance, if I buy an air conditioner, the operating emissions are pretty easy to calculate. I know how much energy it uses, but the problem is it's made in China these days. And so those are basically emissions that are right now under the accounting credited against China. But in fact, if I buy the air conditioner, when you're talking consumption instead of production, those emissions from making the air conditioner are not Chinese, they're mine. They should be on my ledger, not theirs, because they are what we call in the building industry as embodied carbon. It's the critical point. Most people in this conference are aware of the importance of embodied carbon, but it's an issue of everything that we do in our lives. I always thought it was a terrible name because it's not embodied in the product, it's in the atmosphere, and it's counting against the carbon budget now. It's not a life cycle emission, it's a now emission, it's upfront. Some have actually credited me with being the first to use the term. I popularized it and it's getting picked up. And you can see now it is even in these tables, the upfront carbon is the product and construction stage in building. The upfront carbon is emitted before a building is operational and can significantly outweigh operational carbon if the building is really efficient. That's why so many people are looking at things like mass timber and moving away from concrete. Upfront carbon isn't in the bylaws, but it isn't in regulations, but people are beginning to talk about it. And if you think upfront carbon is a problem in buildings, well, in everything else, it's far, far worse. If you look at my iPhone 11, it's got 80 kilograms of carbon emissions in its manufacture. When you look in the details, only 13% of it is in the use of the phone. 80 kilograms. You think about how much that weighs. And people just don't understand embodied carbon. I love this one where Hyundai is in their advertising asking, why shouldn't a car have the same emissions as a bike? And someone's written on it, because of the carbon emissions embedded in the material. They understand it. And there's no real declaration anywhere. Like with some building materials, there is now a declare form that lists the embodied carbon, but you don't know what the embodied carbon is of a pickup truck. And when you plan or design and think about upfront emissions, it really changes the way you build, the way you do architecture, the way you build your cities. You would never build useless things like this restaurant in a stick that Foster is proposing for London. Where I live, the politicians all hate streetcars because they get in the way of them driving quickly. So they're spending billions to basically bury streetcars in concrete tunnels, which has 27 times the carbon footprint of surface routes, when they should be just doing this. In Toronto, where I live, and lots of other cities, they're knocking down perfectly good 20-story towers to build 60-story towers. Whereas 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when the zoning wasn't the way it was, you could build these things. You could build little apartment buildings next to single-family houses. Basically, what I've done is took this chart from the World Green Building Council on how to reduce carbon in buildings, and I applied it to my life. You don't buy what you don't need. You use what you have to the best advantage, and you make it last. You optimize material usage and buy the lowest carbon option and avoid waste. Now, I won't go through the food and the diet very much for this audience because we're talking about buildings. I will just note that eating for climate is different than being a vegetarian or being a vegan, because you find it's all about the beef, that fish is far lower, that tomatoes in North America that are grown in hothouses can be worse than fish and cheese, and that cheese is worse than pork. So basically, you have to eat down the greenhouse emissions. And for me, that just meant giving up on red meat and cutting down waste. The amount of wasted food in North America in particular is extraordinarily huge. Also cutting down on portion sizes. Everything's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger because we're not eating in restaurants and people put value on this. So food portions have just grown. And because they've grown in restaurants, they've grown in our houses. This is a comparison of 50 years ago, a typical serving of pasta to today. Now, what we did in our house was we ate basically a traditional Ontario diet, which meant, you didn't eat a lot of good stuff in winter. You didn't have things. You don't have that problem in Portugal. So you didn't have to eat like this or eat all the tomatoes that my wife can. I remember being in Portugal 2 years ago and being so impressed at the wonderful seafood you had, which of course is local and is a very low footprint, and seeing that they were even adding advertising for vegetarian burgers, vegetarian Whoppers. I was very impressed with this. So for food, basically, eat less, eat local, eat more fish, and eat less meat. Now, how we live, this is a very Canadian story. This is not going to be your story. You know, where I live 150 years ago, 120 years ago, it was just north of the city. It was the playground of the rich, and it was all farmland, separated from the city by a very big valley. So there was nothing up at the top of that hill. Then in 1912, they filled it in. And that was all filled in with crap out of coal furnaces and garbage. It's a totally toxic hill. And they put streetcar tracks in. And in about 1910, it looked like this. And it looks like this today. And I live in what was then basically a streetcar suburb. You could take the streetcar, you could get off, and you could walk to your house that would be very close to the streetcar. So in 1890, it looked like this. And by 1920, 25 years later, after the streetcar was in, it looked like this, all built out. And that's my house in the middle. And this was the streetcar in 1928, and this is it today. It's what you call, and what most people are talking about now, is a 15-minute city. That if I want, I can go find a co-working space, I can go to my doctor. And the problem is there, as you see, is that land use and transportation are the same thing. They work together, they define how we live. So when after World War II, when they built the interstate highways in the United States and they opened them all up to cars, it developed instantly into sprawl, into suburbia, where everybody got their house and their car. And in North America, this is still how people think, that this is the future we want, according to Elon Musk. This is still the dream, that you'll have the single big house, but it'll have solar shingles, a Powerwall battery, and 2 Teslas in the garage. It is zero operating emissions, but vast upfront carbon emissions. And of course, it takes vast amounts of land and a lot of money. It doesn't scale. That's why we should be increasing density, perhaps like they do in Vienna, where everybody lives in multifamily housing. We know now how to build with low upfront carbon materials like wood, which is happening a great deal. Where it's cold, we know now to, well, really everywhere, to build with passive house. In Canada, the issue was dealing with cold. Obviously, you don't have that problem to the same degree. We know now that we can minimize heat loss. If we minimize heat loss, then we can heat or cool our homes with very, very small heat pumps that don't take much energy if our houses are done properly. We know how to build simple forms that minimize the amount of materials that go into buildings, like these I saw in Munich. Whereas what's happening in North America with Bjark and Kittel is that they're doing everything that they can to maximize surface area and complexity. It's ridiculous. So in new buildings, we should be using natural materials with low embodied carbon, lots of insulation and high quality windows, basically passive house. We should be reducing demand as much as possible in existing buildings. And we should be building 15-minute cities. Now, how we move, again, is totally related to basically how we live. And in America, where cars have just been getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of the way they're doing the regulation. And I see the same thing is happening in Europe too. Not to this extreme where the cars are so ridiculously huge, you can't see anyone. But again, it was always that American dream. This is 70 years ago. You've got the house, you've got the car, you got the boat, you got the house, you got the car. I don't see a boat. But the fact of the matter is that electric cars are still cars. They still get parked on the sidewalk. They're no different when it comes to congestion from electric cars, autonomous cars, or Uber cars. And they have a ridiculously high embodied carbon. A Tesla Model 3, when you come right down to it, over its life cycle, is not like zero carbon. It's about half as bad as a conventional vehicle. And if you go and buy one of these new Ford electric pickup trucks, it's actually worse than the life cycle emission of a small European car. And when I did this analysis, the CEO of our company called to complain, to say, how can you not be promoting electric cars? But you've got to get across this idea of embodied carbon. If you understand upfront carbon, you know it's a disaster. Now, again, you know this stuff. You've got these things figured out in Portugal. I saw this, and it was lovely. What I've done is I got myself an electric bike. I didn't drive at all for the entire year. I drove my e-bike. Canada's cold. In winter, I had to dress up a little bit to go through. But last winter, this was 2 years ago, last winter, it didn't even get cold enough to do this. We have to redesign our cities to have a place for everyone, not just cars. I noticed in Toronto, where I live, because of the COVID crisis, they actually made it look a lot like Vienna. And you guys have this figured out anyway. I've seen you've got the streetcars, you've got public elevators and public escalators. You know how to deal with this. This is a problem you've beat. The other thing that I found is it's really hard to get in a plane. I mean, this will be my biggest consideration if I'm invited to come next year to Portugal, because this has a huge footprint. When our company got bought last year, I had to go to New York for 30 hours, and it basically, in carbon, took up a month of my carbon's allowance. You're not without the problems here. I mean, this train that I took from Porto to Aveiro 2 years ago cost more than the flight from London to Porto. There's a real imbalance in how we pay for these things and what they cost. That's just not right. So the key thing that I found in mobility is that the biggest single factor is the car. You've got to get rid of it. You've got to choose where you live carefully so that you don't have to drive, and fly as little as possible. The other thing is what we buy, and this was my big problem. This was, people don't normally think about what they buy. I happen to have an Apple fixation and buy just about everything that they have. And when I total it up, it's insane. My iPhone was 80 kilograms. My 27-inch iMac was almost a ton, 824 kilograms. My MacBook Air, 174. My iPad Pro, 113. Even my dinky little watch is 38 kilograms that I can't lift. So it all totaled up to 400 kilograms a year, 16% of my annual budget, the single biggest item after my gas. The other thing also in North America, and I suppose in Europe too, is the amount of waste. It used to be that you got everything delivered in returnable, refillable packages. Coca-Cola and other drinks were in refillable bottles, and they couldn't travel very far because they're heavy. Where I live in Ontario, there were 5 breweries just for one brand. Now there are 1. It's all because of this guy, Bill Coors, who invented the 2-piece aluminum can. And with the American interstate highways, you could centralize production of beer all in one giant brewery in Colorado. McDonald's realized that when everybody was in their cars, they no longer had to pay for restaurant space, for tables, for chairs, for waiters. They could outsource all of that to us. And they had to train us. Nobody understood about garbage. There weren't very many waste baskets. Everybody just threw it everywhere. So the packaging companies trained us to throw things away and to recycle. They've convinced people around the world that recycling is the most virtuous thing that you can do in your lives. All the toys from kids, from the earliest age, recycling. So much the American Institute of Architects did a study and found that when you ask Americans what lets you lead a longer and healthier life, and the very first thing is recycling. Whereas we know that it's a fraud. We know that almost none of it actually is recycled. What is recycled is downcycled, and only 2% of the plastic waste that we put into the marketplace is actually being still used, recycled. And they say they're going to have a circular economy and they're going to take the plastics back. But we know it's a farce because nobody's recycling properly now. It all has to be picked up. Only 14% is getting picked up, so nothing changes. Their business is turning fossil fuels into petrochemicals, and then into single-use plastics, and then into garbage, so that we buy more fossil fuels. But people are lazy. Even when they're in a restaurant and there's waste baskets everywhere, that's how it ends up. In my year, I tried to avoid ever buying single-use plastics or drink out of a can. And, you know, if you want a coffee, you go and sit down and you enjoy your coffee. So really, the whole thing is sufficiency. How much do you really need? For any consumer good, the best strategy is to buy high quality with timeless design, maintain it well, and use it for as long as you can. I won't spend any time on the sort of leisure activity other than to mention that I used to love driving 2.5 hours north of Toronto to get in a snowboard, to get electrically winched up a hill, and then slide down artificial snow made with electricity and water from the lake. I had to give that up. So I bought cross-country skis and I strapped them to my e-bike and I went to the neighboring park. And you know, I had a lot of fun. It took less time and saved money, and I got better exercise. In the end, in my whole study, I really found, and this is what applies again, what you learn from buildings applies in life, that embodied carbon, the upfront carbon emissions from making stuff, is more important than the operational emissions, and becoming more so every day. My electronics use nothing to run, but the carbon emitted while making them has buried me. And the same is true for our homes, our cars, and our buildings, and everything made from metal or silicon or carbon. Transportation matters. And basically, you know, the world that I see that we really should be living in is like this picture of Stockholm in 1928, where everybody is like either in bicycles or on streetcars. So I updated that IPCC ad. Besides, every action matters, and every year matters, and every choice matters. Really, we have to know all the time that upfront carbon matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Llyod. Now I have some questions from the audience. I will put it in English. If someone wants to put the question directly, you can raise the hand and I will give the word. We have one question from Claude. He's saying, because I think Llyod already start answer, but I think it's better if he will answer again in a loud voice. Hi Llyod, what is your view on internet data traffic reaching 5% of global electricity consumption?
Well, I actually looked at this issue recently. When you look at what's happened with data on the internet, it's really an almost Moore's law of efficiency. As the data services have gotten bigger, they have gotten much, much more efficient. A lot of the big companies have switched to renewables. They've moved a lot of their data centers to cooler places, and the actual per capita consumption of sort of internet bandwidth is going down constantly. Now, to counter that, the amount of stuff that we're watching has gone up dramatically. I was actually talking just last week with the head of sustainability from Netflix, and most of the carbon footprint of watching Netflix is in fact from the production, not from the bandwidth. In their own estimates, they conclude that the internet usage is actually only 5% of their total footprint, that much of it is production and much of it is flying everyone around to do productions. When you actually look at the consumption of an individual, when I did the calculations for my book, I found that the numbers per capita are actually going down. And the biggest footprint of all is, in fact, in the fact that everybody's going out and buying widescreen TVs. And if you look at the upfront carbon from actually manufacturing that TV, it's far worse than anything else. So it is a problem. I don't believe it is 5% anymore. It is constantly going down, actually, rather than up. And again, you have to look at it in terms of per capita emissions, how much per person, and it's actually pretty tiny.
Thank you very much. I would ask you, as we are in a Passivhaus conferences, and I know you have a very deep knowledge of what Passivhaus means. I would ask you to elaborate on the relation between your talk and the Passivhaus requirements.
Well, I was actually inspired in the way I have been doing this by the Passivhaus movement, that when you look in principle of the two directions things are going in right now, there's people who say, oh, we have to build net zero. And there are other people who say, no, if you look at Passivhaus isn't about balancing, oh, I do this here, so I plant trees there and I offset. You know, the net zero concept doesn't work in buildings, as we know, because there's summer and there's winter and it doesn't store. And it's basically fuzzy mathematics, fuzzy math, as Bronwyn Berry calls it. Passivhaus is about making absolute reductions in consumption. And I took the approach that we do in Passivhaus, that people do, which is keep it simple and reduce consumption, and basically applied those to my life. So I think that so Passivhaus was, in fact, in many ways, the inspiration for the model. And I know that you've got always in your graphic from Portugal, which isn't everywhere else, where you've got that electric car in your drawing, that you tie in transportation to how you live. Instead of looking at Passivhaus just as one little slice of life, you in Portugal have added that electric car into that image. And I think that's the point, that we have to think outside of silos, that we're not in our little bubble, but that the Passivhaus concept stretches through your entire life. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yes, very much. And I think it was very interesting the way you relate your technical gadgets with your carbon allowance, annual carbon allowance. And I can relate with that question, because I think I can skip up various stuff, but when it relates to technical some things, the phones, the computers, sometimes the cars, I think everyone somehow loses their ecological conscience when it comes to. And you are talking about Netflix, and that brings to another concept that is easier to skip in essential than in leisure. The pleasure of the humankind is something difficult to restrain. So you have 1 year experience of taking count of everything. So what was the thing you missed the most?
Well, one of the things that I found is that, living a low carbon lifestyle doesn't mean you have to give up a lot of things. And you in Portugal, of course, have it much easier. You get to eat good fish year round. I think I missed sort of imported vegetables in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. It's harder here. I think the thing I missed more than anything is that I love to travel, and I loved coming to Portugal the 2 times that I did. And I was deeply sorry that this COVID came and prevented me from doing that. And I think that when I try to keep this up, which I'm still trying to do, travel is going to be the hardest thing. Yeah. And you in Europe are so lucky because you have good trains and everything is sort of close together. If I want to see you, I have no choice but to get in a plane. And I think that's going to be the biggest problem with a low carbon lifestyle. Otherwise, I don't think I gave much up. I just made changes. The word I think is decoupling. You can, if you look at everything, decouple from high carbon things. I decoupled my transportation from carbon by getting an e-bike. I decoupled my food from carbon, from methane, by stopping to eat red meat, but it didn't mean I couldn't eat fish. Just look at everything. Can you make a low carbon choice to do the same thing? But ultimately, I didn't give much up at all.
Okay, it's somehow what we did with COVID. In first time, you saw it as a restraint, and then you start adapting. You are going more to the ground, to the small shops and something like that. So we have another question. Okay, now they start coming. Okay, José Dias asks how you recycle your old snowboard.
I was just thinking about that last week because it's still in my closet. And I thought before winter comes, I'm going to have to find someone who wants my old snowboard because I don't think I'm getting on it again. And what's this question?
Then we have Homero Leal that asks, we hear a lot about the electric cars rampage boom. What will it take for more and more people, governments, cars, companies, get it real and start approaching the main issue with cars related to the upfront carbon you mentioned?
Well, yeah, it's not just the upfront carbon. The cars are just... electric cars are no different than regular cars when it comes to the highways needed, to the congestion that they cause, to the number of people that they kill on the roads, to the way they ruin cities. I mean, they even still pollute because the tire wear puts up a lot of particulates that are still, they pollute almost half as much as regular cars. And when you look at the cars that they're making in the United States now, they're huge. They're going with the same SUV sizes when, you know, batteries are a function of weight. If you have a big, heavy car, you need more batteries, which means more lithium mining, which means more cobalt mining. And governments just have to realize, I'm sorry, if we're actually going to get to 1.5 degrees, we have to get rid of cars. We have to look for alternatives, which are transit, which are bikes, which are scooters. I never had so much fun as I did in Lisbon when I was last there because you had scooters, which we don't have. They're still banned in Toronto. And I went all around Lisbon on those wonderful scooters, and your wonderful marble streets are absolutely terrible. I felt like my teeth were going to shake out, but it's so much fun to go for micro mobility. And that's the future, not electric cars.
I myself switched not entirely to electrical bicycle, but the city is not well designed for a two-wheels vehicle. We have to change with the lanes that are for the bicycles. Portugal need to change. Other countries already did it. We have more questions here. Marina, I don't think it's a question, it's just a commentary about maybe travel less and do some conferences like this one. And Pedro Pinheiro, everything or almost is recycled. It's a matter of costs, and in extractive economy, where long-term environmental costs are externalities, snowboards are not recycled. Okay.
Well, they are recycled. It is recyclable because it can be, you know, first of all, recycling is the last thing we should ever do. Recycling is so far down the list. I mean, the first should be reuse, repurpose, and, you know, someone else is going to enjoy my snowboard, and we should be refilling bottles and not recycling bottles.
Yes.
And, you know, I when I was in Copenhagen and you look at that big, gorgeous incinerator that Bjarkingels designed that you can ski down the roof of, and they make a virtue out of burning plastic. They actually import garbage from other places because they don't have enough to keep that place we're going. And this is not smart. All you're doing is burning fossil fuels that took an extra step through your plastic bottle. So we have to stop thinking about recycling altogether and get back to sort of repurpose, reuse.
Yes, upcycle. Sometimes you get extra utilization for some. Maybe your snowboard can be a board in the wall for something.
The most popular post I ever wrote about 15 years ago started off. The title was "Recycling is Bullshit," and nobody, thought it's been taken down because our new owners decided that Google won't like that title. But then at the time it was shocking. Now people are getting it, that when they realized that we were never recycling, we were just shipping everything to China. And it was all a fraud, as I said in my talk, to train us to pick up single-use plastic instead of throwing it on the ground. So, let's be done with it.
Yes, you are very right. When you recycle something, you are using energy to change its state. Sometimes more energy than what things are valuing.
It's almost always downcycling. Anyhow.
Okay. I don't know, João, should we change guest or?
I have one question or a comment. This is the image that Llyod was talking about, I believe. That we try to include in this scenario the electric mobility in the overall living style, not only the passive house, not only the building, but trying to include. But when we talk about Bjarke, he defends that the hedonistic future could change the future, could be the switch to change the future. So, and this is the example of this building that you show, but from a different angle, and this looks a lot like a heat dissipator from the computers. And he has a plan to redesign the Earth to stop climate change. So, how worried should we be about these plans and about the role of this type of architects because they are seen as role models for young architects, from students, and taking advantage of having a professor here. How do you see this?
I think it's a huge problem. Go back a slide to that building in Vancouver. I mean, the way they built this thing, when I was a developer before I was a writer, and I did a building where I had decks on top of living spaces, and it leaked. And I was told, well, they always leak. This is why you don't do this. And if you look at this building, every single balcony is on top of another living space. The surface area is maximized. You couldn't put more material into this thing if you tried. To get a reasonable level of efficiency, all of those walls are expensive vacuum panels. The ridiculous amount of energy and effort that went into building this thing is off the scale, and like I predicted, it leaks. They've got millions in lawsuits, water's pouring into units all over the place, and we absolutely should not be building this thing. And everybody loves Bjarke, and I just look at it, and like your great slide at the beginning, I see thermal bridges in your slide. When I look at Bjarke, I see, because I was a developer, I see cost overruns and lawsuits and lawyers for the rest of my life. And I just can't imagine that people fall in love with this stuff, but they do. We have to weigh, Norman Foster once worked for Bucky Fuller, and he clearly forgot the lesson. But Bucky Fuller asked him, Mr. Foster, how much does your building weigh? And he couldn't understand. he took that into at the time, but now look at what Norman Foster's doing. Like I showed that stupid restaurant in the stick that he did in London. And he just pulled out of Architects Declare because he was being criticized for designing airports. And he said, well, we still need airports. So I'm going to build green airports. You can't build a green airport. It's a contradiction in terms. So, you know, that's how I feel about Bjarke. Excuse me if I get angry here.
Okay, I think now we can skip the question, because the other one is also a commentary about how the pandemic changes the traveling way of people. We are starting to do our reunions, our conferences this way, and skipping the travel time and the travel expenses from go to one place to the other. We have some also a bad side, but now it's not the place to talk about that part. I think now we can pass to the other invitee, João. Yes? Okay. I will switch again to Portuguese. Andrew, sorry, desculpem. Andrew Michler, I think, yes, é Certified Passivhaus Designer no Hyperloc Workshop, que é a empresa que ele participa. Tem concentrado a sua ação na concepção e materialidade de edifícios de alto desempenho desde 1993. Tem escrito e investigado extensivamente sobre a nova arquitetura e é o autor do livro Hyperlocalization of Architecture, lançado em 2015. É cofundador da Passivhaus Rocky Mountains e fez parte da direção da Passivhaus Network. Ele concluiu a primeira International Certified Passivhaus no Colorado em 2016, que ganhou vários prémios e tem sido proeminente nos meios internacionais do design e da arquitetura. Ele tem sido keynote speaker em algumas reuniões internacionais e incluindo na área da Passivhaus. Again, Andrew Michler, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Andrew Michler. I'm a certified Passivhaus consultant and Passivhaus designer based in Colorado. It's a great pleasure to be presenting with you guys today in Portugal on Passivhaus and some thoughts on Passivhaus from my experience over the years. And I was going to present on a specific project that I've been working on for the past few years, a multifamily residential project. I'll go in some detail about not just the Passivhaus component, but the social component, the carbon component of architecture, and specifically how to integrate Passivhaus into a larger social movement and need that we have, especially around climate change. And climate change is something that's affected me quite personally. In fact, this is a map of where my Passivhaus is. The little star, gold star in the middle is where my Passivhaus home is located. And right next to it, you can see a brown splotch. Last year we had a large forest fire, the largest in where I live in Colorado. I actually live in northern Colorado near Rocky Mountain National Park. And we had the largest fire of Colorado history come right up to my property. And we're seeing just significant change extremely rapidly throughout the continental west of the United States from climate change. And, you know, it hits close to home, especially on how we build and how we will think about building in the future around the carbon question in particular. My firm's called Hyperlocal Workshop. Some of the work I've done is mostly in the residential area. I'm working on projects from New York to California and Colorado. Happily, they're all certified projects, and all the clients are extremely keen on not just certification, but the quality of the building themselves and the quality of the space. So we look to have a really well-rounded, aesthetically significant type of design. It's experimental, but very much based on place. And Passive House works very well with that, of course, because it's so climate interdependent. I've also wrote a book called Hyperlocalization of Architecture that was published maybe 6 years ago. It's available in Europe and just about anywhere in the world. And it's also a book on kind of global projects around the world, specifically around the idea of hyperlocalization of architecture, which means how does contemporary architecture work with both the culture and the place, both environmentally and aesthetically and functionally. And one of the things I've learned of the past few years was that the way that we talk about what we call sustainable building, green building, resilient building, all these terms are often based on very specific terms that are near to perhaps our own professional goals or professional needs. But buildings are really quite complex. Cities are even more complex in the integration of buildings and cities and in places. So the way I want to kind of look at talking about buildings in this talk is kind of a broader sense of what building design does, using Passive House as kind of the core metric, as well as carbon. Passive House, even though, as we know, it's an energy standard, it covers significant other things around the health and well-being of occupants. But the social impact, the idea of urbanization, density, the materiality of buildings is just as critical. And the project that I'm going to present on is called Temporal House, and it's part of the European Cultural Center's Venice Biennale this year. I've been working on it for a couple of years, and this is a photo of the installation in Plaza Moro in Venice. And the Italian Architecture Biennale theme of 2021 was, how will we live together? That was the question. And my question back was, where will everyone go? And to frame that, this very well-written ProPublica article goes into the story of climate change and how it's affecting migration in Central America and forcing people to move north due to the change in the climate environment where they live. And I'll read this quote for the context of where will everyone go and how we design buildings for them. By 2070, the kind of extremely hot zones like in the Sierra now cover less than 1% of the Earth's land surface, could cover nearly a fifth of the land, potentially placing 1 of every 3 people alive outside the climate niche where humans have thrived for thousands of years. And that's the reality that we have to design for. Many of the buildings that we're designing now and building now will be here in 2070. So keeping that in mind, what that social impact will be, should be very much a part of how we think about what we are building. And in this case, I was thinking very much about Los Angeles. In fact, my publisher, Ivolo, for my book, was just down the street on Wilshire Boulevard. And I got quite fascinated by the street and walked it quite a bit. I did quite a bit of research on it. And it turns out to be the original strip mall, the invention of the strip mall in the Americas. And strip malls, of course, where car dependent, where you go to park your car in front of a business, get your materials, your groceries, and then jump back in your car and go down the road again to the next business. So we're reclaiming the idea of reclaiming Wilshire Boulevard back to a pedestrian place, a place for people again. So I found a funny little lot as a proposed site for this project. It's a multifamily project. It's near the metro. It's near downtown. And there's, of course, lots of tarmac, what we call parking and concrete Wilshire. So it's about reactivating that space again. And the place I started from is rethinking what a 21st century shop house would be like. And traditionally, especially in Southeast Asia, but certainly all around the world. Many people came to live and have small businesses within a single building, often the storefront, and then living in the back, sometimes multiple generations. But it was a compact way to integrate the socioeconomic process of integrating into a new place for many generations have passed. So the idea was how to design a building to work with that impact. And then I was very inspired by a trip to Japan, a couple of trips, in fact, specifically into Kyoto and the form factors there, which I found quite elegant, especially on the street side. And the other thing I was very inspired by, and something also I've seen lots on Wilshire Boulevard and in Los Angeles in general, is the food truck culture, which is basically taking what we call the brick and mortar and turning that into a mobile food business, which is much more realized for people from different social economic stratus. So we designed and developed a small food truck that won an architecture award, which is great fun, but also it's basically an espresso bar. It's mobilized and solar powered. And I'm having a lot of fun working around the idea of mobile micro businesses. So the idea was to integrate those concepts into a multifamily passive house in Los Angeles. The building we're looking at is 8 stories. I'll go a little bit into the program later, but this is the general impact it has on the street side, where it's much more perforated than typically the architecture is. So it's opening people, inviting people in from the street into the place to enjoy. That very much is about activating the sidewalk scene and giving people a place to sit, to congregate, to enjoy themselves. And then further alongside the building is a place for food trucks to gather, and a protected place for people to both wait in line for their food and to sit and enjoy it during lunch, during the evening. And then just kind of an aesthetic, here's an aesthetic section of what the space looked like. And as a passive house, one of the first issues we have to deal with is orientation. Los Angeles, a hot, dry climate, chose a lot that was actually less than optimized, let's say, for a building such as a passive house, especially with the solar heat gains. And the west side is actually where all the apartments will be facing on the 4 stories of apartments that the building has. It has about 29, I believe, apartments in total. And they will be reserved for different immigrants from Central America is the idea, from single people to families. And from the orientation point of view, since we're facing west, we had to really be extremely aggressive on the shading on the exterior, which I know in Europe is quite common. In the United States, it's almost unheard of to do exterior shading. So that, of course, was a critical component to the functioning of the building. The good form factor, of course, is also critical to the building. So compact, simplified, even if it has some elaborate projections from it, the core building itself is somewhat simple. It's what we call a single loaded building. So that means that it has one hallway on the side, in this case to the north side, and then a single row of apartments. The first floor is actually a commissary kitchen, public restrooms, public amenities, perhaps a small bar, things like that. The commissary kitchen is a place for people inside the building to actually either support the food trucks or to run their own food businesses, catering businesses, things like that. So it's very much about the integration of people's lifestyle and work into Los Angeles and provide them a means, an economic means as well. Then micro apartments, small apartments, multifamily apartments with multiple floors, and then finally an outdoor space on top, which would be great to use as a school, place to maybe even grow vegetables in an adaptive program over time. Give you a sense of what the floor is, especially in the sense of passive house, is that because it's single loaded, we can easily provide cross ventilation in each floor from the hallway into the individual apartments. The apartments have what in Imperial 4 by 8 foot windows. They're tilt turn, of course, so they open, so they're kind of de facto balconies in that sense. The elevator shaft will give access through the building and to the roof. The mechanical is right behind the elevator shaft. The mechanicals, I have another slide that goes into some detail on that. Open kitchen, the floor plan also has an open space on the street side, so the balconies are connected throughout the building, and then shared kitchen spaces and different size apartments, as I mentioned. On the carbon side, on the material side, the proposal is using a straw panel system. It's called EcoCocon, and it's a prefabricated passive house panel. And then the podium underneath is made from cross-laminated and nail-laminated timbers. In this case, we're using a product called Lignolock, which is a wooden nail. And this actually passes code in the United States, this type of construction now, as of just this year. So we can build up to 8 stories in all timber, which is really fantastic. Also, with fire, earthquake, all those other things are considered a part of the code at this point. The EcoCocon panel actually, because of the density and the silicon straw, is actually quite fire resilient, and that's the first question people often have, is that straw must burn, but in fact the wood burns before the straw does because of the compactness of the way that straw is packed, and because much of the material is indeed not supporting flame. So it's also quite earthquake resilient. It stacks quite well, so it's fundamentally a carbon positive and very durable, robust building system for passive house, and especially even at scale, which is very much the idea of the low carbon building movement. On the timber side, the Podium, which is earthquake resistant, is this product that's being developed by Beck using these wooden nails that they created, which you can build in small scale shops, even using automated systems using wood nails. We also don't need to use glues, things like that. So it's quite a strong, robust product, structural component to the building, but also earthquake resilient, and something that we can easily deconstruct over time because of the lack of glue and fasteners within the slabs themselves. So that's the core of the building. Very much the mechanical systems are on each floor. To simplify it, I can still use components that are certified passive house that are now made in the United States, including our ventilation system, our windows. We were able to develop this as a passive house premium building with the help of the Passive House Institute in the energy modeling supporting that. And the compactness of the building is quite key to its success, especially in kind of these more narrow urban lots. Now, the carbon question, I'll get in some detail about how we dealt with carbon with the building. Our ongoing operational energy is minus 130, or say a net positive 130 kilowatt hours per square meter on an annual basis. And that's due to the Passive House premium certification process using the primary energy renewable system, which is very much about both the renewables and the footprint of the building and the building density. So this is a good example of how renewables and density merge together quite well into a passive house system. And then the embodied carbon, I did some work on developing calculations for the embodied carbon. And that's at 224 kilograms emitted per square meter total for the construction of the building. On the PV system, it's very interesting that, you know, of course, in Passive House, we like to not think about net, but in real terms of energy usage. So in production, we have to be as aware of the lowest time of energy production, which is typically in the winter as we are on peak. And I found it interesting to see that in this particular use case that the horizontal panels in summer peak quite a bit of energy, but the vertical panels in winter provide almost as much energy as the vertical system does. So overall, when we look at our peak demand needs, are well balanced with our production in the wintertime, which is an important critical component of the energy production in Passive House, which is well beyond what we talk about when we talk about net zero buildings, for instance, which are not time-based. And here's the verification chart. It was really very satisfying to see that we could develop a building that didn't actually have a real heat load need. It was just a cooling load, which also helped with the simplification of the mechanical system, for instance. In fact, I found that putting in just double pane windows raised the heating demand quite a bit, which would complicate the installation, use more energy. So the triple panes were using triple pane, even Los Angeles, works quite well, A, because of the street noise and all the activity down below, but also because of the quality of living inside, but also because it simplifies other parts of the building, which is this integrated process that we get to learn from Passive House, how windows affect mechanicals, how it affects quality of the environment, from sound, acoustics to temperature, things like that. For the carbon calculation, I used something called the pH ribbon, which is a plugin for the PHPP that uses the RIBA's methodologies for carbon. And it's really important to understand, especially around the carbon question of the embodied carbon, what we call it, is that there's a lot of assumptions that can be left out. So finding out what a true carbon number can be quite nuanced. First of all, it starts with the materials. Timber storage and the straw, of course, is a significant long-term storage. Straw has a renewable rate on annual basis. Timber is much longer, up to 40 to 50 years to reclaim that carbon, so you have to replant forests. And also the materials at the end of the building's use cycle, if we just burn the materials or bury them, they can easily go back into the atmosphere again. So that's accounted for as well. So the idea of deconstructibility, to be able to reuse these materials, to be able to at least design and anticipate the reuse of carbon materials in the building is very important. Similar to like beautiful old brick or stone buildings or the mass timber buildings of centuries ago, much of that material can be reused over and over and over again. And what also is very surprising is that the solar electric system needs to be replaced every 20, 30 years or so. So as an ongoing basis, along with mechanical systems, things like that, that has an impact on the carbon footprint of the building over time. And then the upfront cost. The PV is actually the most significant embodied carbon component of the building. So there is a point where if we remove the PV from this particular project, we would be essentially carbon neutral in the material side, but with the PV, it does actually have significant impact on the overall upfront carbon. So there's always a payoff between the renewables carbon side and batteries, things like that, and then the energy savings just from using materials and not needing PV in the first place. So it's really important to be aware and conscious of that balance, at least from the embodied overall total carbon impact of the building on site and the boundary conditions, which is a very complex conversation. But it's fun to explore, especially in this project, and to see what real large-scale zero or very low carbon buildings holistically can work. And with that, you know, I like to think of this project, for myself at least, as the Passive House is a form of optimism in design, that it provides the critical pathways to really understand what the true short-term and long-term impact of buildings, especially if we look for adaptive buildings that can work over time with minimal inputs. In this case, you know, integrating a immigrant culture from climate change into a city that was built of immigrants. Most of our cities are going to be going through this radical transformation, if not already. Many of them are already stressed for housing. So the idea that we can build buildings that are a net benefit, both socially and from a carbon standpoint, is very much based on the idea of following the metrics, being quite thorough in the way we can design buildings. And for me, at least personally, I found the Passive House as extremely adept at that process. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you guys all had a great conference, and I'll enjoy answering questions with you.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting and clear presentation. We already have more or less a comment than a question in the chat. It's about regenerative soil techniques and increase of shadow areas. By trees, in this case, is not possible by the height of the building, or artificial, are essential now. If every chance we have to introduce sun protection is used, don't you think we can help at least a bit? Focus on it as one of the prime goals for every planning. What do you think about that? The introducing of the shadings in the for instance, in the west windows of the building.
Well, certainly, you know, introducing
external shading.
Yes, yes. The problem is going high with buildings. We have this, landscapes like to be flat and buildings like to be tall. And so that interaction doesn't necessarily work when we start building tall buildings and trying to support biodiversity in places like cliffside. Like living in Colorado, I can tell you that the steeper a mountainside is, the less vegetation you'll find on it. So that creates a complexity. But certainly on the street side, more where people are. I like to see where people can interact with nature. On the first two levels on this building, of course, it's on the third level. We have some plants just to kind of create a buffer between the living spaces and the busy street side below. But plants should be where people are, I think, generally, because that's where we're outside the most. So plants shouldn't be for the buildings, they really should be for the people. We can create artificial shading, which I think will work probably in the long term, less structural issues to deal with, less ongoing maintenance, things like that. But where you have a person, you should have a plant, basically.
I will connect the two presentation. Llyod was talking about when you have a balcony, they leak. When I start working, they said that not only from balconies, but always when we put plants in the balconies, the place for the plants. So what do you think about when you can we integrate nature into buildings without the leakage problem? So it's something we have to consider in the other ways, like external plugs that you put in the building.
Yeah, I think the idea of I've never been a big fan of skyscrapers. I like the idea of court scrapers, where we can build buildings, very large buildings perhaps, that are only 4 or 5 stories, like Llyod showed an image of him behind or in front of that beautiful 1920 social housing project in Vienna that we can definitely integrate landscape with buildings more, especially if the buildings come back towards the land and are a little bit more accessible in that case. Bjarke Ingels was famous for creating these artificial hills. And I thought that was a really wonderful place to start his career. And it's unfortunately become more of the court scraper, these large kind of buildings that decoupled nature or the possibility of nature with humans. But certainly form factor, all these other kind of urban design issues come back to, I think, creating just the right size buildings for people, and not developing. We don't need New Yorks everywhere. We really just need basically old European cities everywhere.
Yes, you are talking about your experience in Japan and in Portugal, in Porto. It's our traditional architecture is like that. You have in the ground floor the workshop, and in the above floors, the 2 or 3 floors above, you have the house of the family. So it is the small scale that is something we relate to. You use natural materials for the insulation, the cocoon and the straws. In Portugal, we have a natural material also that can be used, that is cork. So what do you think is the impact of the shoes of insulation in the upfront carbon goals?
So it's funny, I use cork on a project next to my passive house too. I love cork. So the first impact is, at least for me, was the smell. The client really loved the smell of cork. So I just wanted to throw that in, that I never thought about smell in architecture before. Until I started using cork for facades. But overall, we're finding, and Dr. Benjamin Crick did a wonderful talk at the International Passivhaus Conference on the embodied, or say the upfront carbon of insulation in buildings, and compared to the overall carbon impact of buildings from the energy side. If you can go back to the archives of this year's conference, his is quite detailed. But we're finding that even with plastic insulations, that the insulation is really quite minimal in the overall impact of the building. I can't give specific numbers per building, but it's going to certainly be similar to what your mechanical system, things like that. So adding insulation to a building's, as Dr. Wolfgang Feist has long said, is not a particularly significant impact to the upfront carbon of buildings. Of course, we want to stay away from extruded polystyrenes, extruded polystyrenes, things like that, things that use lots of blowing agents, or certainly fossil fuels behind that. But it's also one of the places where we can look at carbon storage in a very real way. And we're getting to the point where the industries are getting quite robust with providing us very good quality long-term materials. And it looks like the materials that do have a upfront positive carbon are also some materials that have the best strategies for moisture control, things like that. So there's more benefits with natural-based materials than plastic materials, both carbon, longevity, and just the quality of the buildings.
Yes, you can use the materials to retain the carbon, so they are a good way of balance the other bad things the buildings are to the environment. We have a comment. I don't know if a comment or a question. Let me see. Yes, the embodied carbon is in the concrete needed to hold up the trees on the Bosco, which are probably bigger than everything the trees do in absorption of CO2. Okay, it's a comment of Llyod.
It's really important that we throw that out there, because I think, we like to pick on Bjarke Ingels, and rightfully so, because he's the one who always, talks about the hedonistic sustainability, but doesn't really incorporate that to his actual work. We see that a lot in projects where they, the old put a tree on it. We used to call it, Llyod has seen, and I've seen that quite a bit for the past decade or so, where we call ourselves green architects because we put lots of plants on our code-compliant buildings, which are quite beautiful and complex. That's actually the opposite of environmental buildings. And we have to get away from the greenwash thinking, especially in our own work, but also kind of in the design media and the way that we frame what sustainable buildings are. It really should be based on the actual calculations. All of us, if I can, as a single person, can go through and do the carbon calculations on a larger building, certainly help with tools that are developed by Passivhaus community and Passivhaus Institute, then this is accessible to any small, mid, large firm. And it should be just basically, when they build a building, these numbers should be attached to those buildings.
Sometimes we think that, we can have the feeling that the green is something that companies give us to ease our conscience. So it is green, so you can use it and don't think more about it. And we have to challenge that way of doing things. That's true.
Yeah, it's a lifelong job. That's a lifelong kind of process for all of us, is to kind of keep each other honest.
Yes. Sorry, another. Do your eco-cocoon panels come from Slovakia, or there are US production?
So the dream is that Björn Kirov, who developed the eco-cocoon product, his dream is to be able to provide these locally in large building regions. They are in Slovakia now. They are labor intensive currently, so labor is a big part of the cost part of it. But the idea of these being able to be built in North America would be very much a part of what you'd like to do. Of course, we need to, we have to start building them and creating demand for them before the investment can come. But I think we're already seeing in the United States products that you've long been used to, like wood fiber insulation materials. It's called another product I'm sorry, I'm forgetting what the term of it is, but there's products that have been available in Europe for a long time. We're starting to get manufacturers, usually smaller startups, starting to build, are creating the availability of these resources. And certainly Passivhaus components are also available in the United States. So just in the past 5-6 years, I've seen availability of these high performance products, nature-based, are becoming domestic for us in the United States. So we hope to see eco-cocoon be just as successful here as they are in Europe, especially in Northern Europe.
So maybe done with other vegetable materials, because you have byproducts of our agriculture industry that can be used in construction, and they are thrown away every year. So maybe we can start thinking creatively about that. Okay, another question. Oh, you can go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, no, that's all.
No, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Surrounding of buildings, either integrated in its planning or by urban design, I find it extremely important. Example of Lisbon, where some streets have 3 corridors, deciduous leaves, providing a huge difference in summer, temperature to other streets, and comforting buildings. In the winter, no leaves and solar gains come into play, either way, reducing energy consumption by buildings. This is a comment, not a question, but what do you think about the relation to the vegetation when they are in the public space, not in the private?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that that trees. There's a, this is fascinating question in the sense that there's a photographer who lives in a town called Fort Collins, right next to where I live. And he was the photographer for National Geographic assignment. There was a long article about the trees of Los Angeles, and it was basically it was an article about that how trees in Los Angeles are pretty much distributed amongst middle class and wealthier communities, in communities low income and communities in poverty in Los Angeles had significantly less tree cover. And the social, I wouldn't say social, but it's the health impacts of that was actually quite significant, specifically directly due to the lack of trees and natural canopy. Air particulates, part of that was because of industry near freeways, things like that, but also because of the ability of trees to kind of sustain cooler environments and to reduce the spread of dust, things like that, was measurable and significant. And people with less means in neighborhoods without tree canopy suffered really quite directly as a result without that resource, that natural resource that many of us may take for granted in other places. So yes, trees are integral, but trees, cities are not forests, and forests are not cities. So we do have to make a place for trees to thrive and not just stick a tree in a place and hope for the best, that we have to create some sort of habitat for them to do as well.
Yes, you are very right, because we don't. If we put a tree in a place that is not suitable for the tree will die and will be very small. So we have to change also the use of the city. So the street can be a place for the tree.
Yes, and in fact, I'm really, I really love Japan, I have to say, especially around some of their concepts around urbanization. And in Tokyo in particular, they've been very aggressive on tree planting, and that's been very much a social focus for Tokyo in particular for a few years now. And you can feel the difference of the city as a result.
Yes. I would change a little bit the theme now. You show us the timber structures made of the nail timber nails. Can you elaborate a little bit about the way they are constructed? It was very curious because it's not glue, cross-laminated timber by glue, but by timber nails.
Yeah. So first, the first thing is that timber nails, of course, have very, very tiny carbon footprint compared to steel. And what they do is they structurally bond wood to wood. And what they do is they melt when they're nailed into a softwood. The lidkin actually melts as a result from the high pressure and speed friction from the nail going into the wood. And so it creates basically a chemical bond, but I shouldn't say chemical bond. It's a structural bond between the two pieces of wood. And that's strong enough where that they can make these slabs. They're developing essentially robotic tables now. They're getting patents developed for robotic tables, and you don't need a glue press. A traditional cross-laminated timber system, you'll need a large factory that has these. It's fun if you Google it to see how cross-laminated timbers are produced. Basically, they create these big slabs of wood, of course, and then a layer of glue, and another layer of glue, wood glue, like plywood, on, as a lot of people say, on steroids. And then they have to put in this massive press, and it creates quite a bit of infrastructure. And certainly, glue has its own impacts, both environmentally and health-wise. So you avoid that with the mechanical fastening system of wood to wood, and then they created a diagonal component too as well for shear, to improve the shear value of the timbers. So basically, you can build these really beautiful, large slabs in fairly small facilities or without large means. And they also emphasize that it doesn't dull blades, things like that, from cutting through glue compared to wood. So the longevity of the mechanical systems of cutting the slabs is improved as well. And when you talk about at scale, this actually does make a difference. Maybe not for 1 or 2 projects, but when you talk about hundreds of projects, this does have a very real impact.
And the way, if you can do it in a small workshop, you can do locally. You don't have to, in case of Portugal, bring the CLT from another country.
Yeah, and
that.
also, we should talk also really quickly on the nail laminated timber. It's basically this. A lot of people are moving from nail laminated timbers, which are big 2x materials. In the United States, we call them 2x4s, 2x6s, nailed on end. So you make large slabs that are structurally great for floors, things like that. But if they're nails, you can't really cut through them. And nails tend not to move differently than wood, so there is some separation. So they've been moving more towards dowel laminated timbers, where the dowels actually lock the 2x material into place, but that takes a significant machinery as well. So now we can build those in much smaller shops. I could build them myself. In fact, I have the wooden nails and been playing around with building small structural systems just with the wooden nails and 2x material.
No, I will try to look a little bit more because it's very interesting to. The evolution. And when you decide to build on timber, the structure, it was thinking about the carbon.
Yes, because typically, yes.
What was the main reason?
Well, this is called Podium Buildings, so often you have to have a kind of a, in the United States, it's typical, they call them 2/5s or 5/2s. Is kind of the most typical buildings in the West. So we have a concrete base, 2 stories, sometimes 3, but typically 2. And then from there, it's we use stick frame construction, just like how we build houses. We build 5 stories on top of that. So this is simply replacing the traditional concrete podium.
Okay. Because our tradition in Portugal is different, so for us the wood construction is something that was always in the inside of the houses, related to the base and external walls in granite. So the idea of a podium, and maybe if we go to the medieval times, we add that, but in 19th and 20th century, the idea is one systems make it all, not a podium of one system and another construction on, and for instance, balloon frame or something like that. And it's interesting the changing for the traditional to the current one, and with also a lightweight structure.
Yeah, it is funny that it's not the way that we build buildings. Our physics is the same, but many of our kind of cultural assumptions about materials and building processes. Yeah, I was very surprised by some of the passive houses in North Spain were very traditionally built, but still passive house. And I was just thinking, oh God, you guys have some serious thermal bridges you have to think about that we don't have to think about as much, in at least in the Western United States.
You are also a Passivhaus consultant, so sometimes you consult others, architects, about their projects.
I do a little bit, but over the years I found out that it's just a lot easier to start from the beginning. From the beginning means designing my own projects. And I also I tend to get bored pretty quickly, so I like projects that are quite unusual, I should say, and clients typically have some unusual ideas about what they want to live, so I enjoy the architectural challenges as well. It is challenging. It's much more challenging to be a consultant than an architect, I have to say, at least in Passive House from my experience, because often there's a lot of these assumptions that architects come in with that need to be dealt with very early in the conversation about how the building is going to work as a passive house. And that can be more challenging than starting with all the correct assumptions from the conceptual stage.
Okay. I don't, João, there is some question from the Facebook or not?
Just one comment, but I would like to add one comment here. I would like to congratulate both Andrew and Llyod for beautiful and inspiring presentations. And I think that both of them, they show us how Passive House can be the foundation of something else. And this is something that we fortunately have been watching and also try to implement, buildings that are more than just high efficient buildings or are more than just passive houses. And I think that's a trend now. And it's very good for the global passive house network that we are already at that stage, because it means that achieving the passive house is not the goal in itself. It's not the ultimate goal, but it's a tool to achieve more, to achieve additional goals, like for instance, natural materials, like for instance, integrate buildings in other energy grids, try to achieve a more resilient and independent, and with Andrew example including here the social aspect, and I think that's very important. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I don't know if Llyod or Andrew can add something.
Well, I actually did want to add something there, because I think it's an important comment, important thing to stress, that, you know, when Passive House started, it was about energy. And, you know, we've all been thinking since the 70s and the oil crises about energy. But what's happened is that we really have to change our fixation and stop thinking about energy and think about carbon. It's carbon emissions that matter now. We know how to get clean energy with solar, and we know how to reduce demand for energy with Passive House. So I completely agree with Llyod that it has to be Passive House is just one part of a much bigger picture. And if you understand Passive House, as I found from my book, if you understand the basic reasons we do Passive House, you can apply it to almost everything. It's again why I love that drawing of yours where you show the car attached to the Passive House, because we all have to realize that transportation in our buildings are two sides of the same coin. And I know that your partner, João, has been bringing food into the picture in some of his work. And it's part of the picture too. You can't separate them anymore. It's all part of a big, I'll call it a passive picture.
What I'm encouraged, I think of Passive House as like a mind training, and there's a training of thinking about systems rather than individual things. Like typically when we first started, we often talk about how to make a green building was the technology question. And then we went on to energy efficiency. And Passive House at least has given us these really deeply, performance-oriented goals and the tools along with it to think with the systems approach. And we can extend that systems approach to kind of what's the next level. It may not be a certification, things like that, but that is very addictive to think within systems to achieve goals rather than as components, and just kind of integrating components and hoping for the best. And that's what kind of where we started from. Passive House broke broke that type of thinking, and it's been very useful as just a process for me personally.
Thank you very much. João was showing us the program. I didn't realize we have to end by 4:30, so we are late. He's kindly remind me that we have to close the session. It was a very, very interesting presentation for you both. The question from the audience were also a way of having more insight of how you think about the several stuffs. And I would like to ask João to close the session, because he's the one that can give us putting all together, because it's the last day of the Congress. So I think João maybe has something to say at the end.
Okay, thank you, Clara, and thank you, Andrew and Llyod. We will continue in Portuguese from now on. Quero agradecer à Clara pela excelente moderação, e foi uma constante aqui desta conferência, que tivemos também moderadores de elevadíssimo desempenho, à semelhança do conceito Passivhaus. Terminamos então assim a sessão 4, vamos agora só passar ao encerramento da conferência. Queremos agradecer os guias que fizeram as visitas guiadas à exposição, e eles foram líderes e reis e senhores dessa tarefa. Também os moderadores da sessão merecem das sessões merecem no fundo, esse título. E depois agradecer também às excelentes apresentações que tivemos, e cada um deles também nos deu algo para levarmos para casa, para pensarmos, para nos fazer rever alguns momentos aqui das apresentações, que de facto há aqui muito conteúdo de interesse relevante. Queremos também agradecer todos os parceiros que estiveram presentes na exposição virtual. Agradecer também a todos os participantes aqui na conferência. Nós tivemos mais de 600 pessoas inscritas. Infelizmente nem todas estiveram aqui no Zoom, mas tivemos cerca de 450 pessoas que acederam às sessões e às visitas aqui no Zoom. Também no YouTube e no Facebook, desde o dia 1, temos estado a ter cada vez mais visualizações. Estes são os números atualizados ao dia de hoje. E deixar aqui no fundo aquela que será a nota para o próximo ano. Vamos estar a celebrar, a associação vai estar a celebrar os 10 anos. Teremos aqui algumas novidades durante o ano, no fundo a fazer esta celebração destes 10 anos de existência da Associação Passivhaus Portugal. Relembrar então aqui os próximos eventos, uma vez mais, os cursos oficiais Passivhaus, Tradesperson e Passivhaus Designer, a iniciar em fevereiro. E a próxima conferência, que desde o início, que é sempre no final do mês de novembro, portanto já sabemos quando é que ela se vai realizar, em final de novembro de 2022, será a 10ª conferência, estão desde já todos convidados. Ainda temos de ver como é que será o modelo do próximo ano, mas sabemos que vai realizar-se, vai ser em final de novembro e vai ser a 10ª conferência. Uma vez mais, agradecer e lançar aqui mais uma vez o apelo a que venham fazer parte desta rede. Passivhaus não é uma rede nacional, é uma rede a nível internacional, para nos ajudar a construir o futuro que queremos. Um último agradecimento aos nossos parceiros de comunicação, aos nossos parceiros institucionais e aos nossos parceiros estratégicos. Muito obrigado a todos.